Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Financial Transformation Live. So today we're going to talk about some things that you can do to build a future-proof finance architecture. So I'm very aware that at the moment, with all of the changes in technology, it can be incredibly hard to decide where to go. You're worried about making sure that whatever you're doing is not just going to last you 12 months, it's going to last you a few years, and that you're setting your organization up for success in the future. So I'm going to talk about things that you can think about with your existing systems, how to think about the layers within your finance architecture, but also what sort of things should you be looking for in the products, the modules that you're buying, the different technologies that you're buying, in order to make sure that they have the very best chance of being okay for you, in not just now in the next 12 months, but also a few years ahead as well. So what are we going to cover? So we are going to cover the components of strong financial systems architecture, common mistakes and risks that you need to consider. Doesn't mean you can't do them, you just need to think about them. The different layers you might want to think about in your longer term strategy, and of course, any questions that you may have as we go through this. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Managing Director and Head of Transformation at ITAS, and I've been working within the technology space for probably longer than I want to admit, over 15 years. But I'm very much focused on not just the technology, but I genuinely, all of the things that go around making a technology implementation successful. So we're known as, we were awarded Customer Success Partner of the Year from Sage. So we've got a reputation and evidence base of making sure that helping people make good transformation decisions. So last session that we did was all about record to report. So what does that maturity model look like? And that was with Neil, who looks after our delivery team, and he took you through some of the things to think about there. And so we are going to start with the components of strong financial system architecture. So I think about it in 4 areas. So you've got to think about your data architecture. So when you're looking at finance systems, and when I say about finance systems, I'm thinking about all of the components that make up your system. You've got to think about your data architecture and how that supports it. You do need to think about API integration, and there's lots of reasons for that, which I'll get into. Expandability, how can this system flex and help you become an agile finance team? And what's the maintenance component of the system that you're looking at? So there are 4 things that you need to think about when you're thinking about your finance system. So let's dig into the first one, which is data architecture. So the reason this is important, there's 2 reasons, right? One is obviously one of the key reasons that people need a good finance system is for reporting. If your data architecture isn't strong enough, then you're going to have challenges getting out the reporting you need. Let's just take away the formats and how they look, but fundamentally being able to report on that information. The second piece is that as new tools develop, particularly in the AI space, they need access to data to be able to support you with things like forecasts and modeling and things. So making sure that you have a really strong data architecture is the foundation of building a future-proofed financial architecture. So my key tenet is that it's got to be multidimensional. So what that means is that when you're working with your ledgers, so you need to be able to analyze not just by customer in the sales ledger, you need to be analyzed by product and those items. You need layers both within your ledgers, but also within your nominal. So that's my key sort of baseline if I'm thinking about a future-proofed architecture. The second thing you need to consider is once you've built so you might have that ability to have a multidimensional architecture, but how easy is it to create different groupings based on that? So thinking about, the sorts of things that you could think about is, can I add fields to each of the objects that sit within it, and then can I expand it? Or am I limited to the pre-built fields within that? So having a flexible, multi-dimensional financial data architecture is really important as you go forwards. And it's not just about your core finance platform, it's also about the modules that sit around it. So you may have an AP tool, an AR tool, you may have a payroll tool. how shared is that data architecture across platforms, and how consistent is it? How well defined is it? So do you have data dictionaries within your team? So you'll notice some of these things are not technology, but about things that you can do as a team to make your systems more robust. So you could establish data dictionaries. So what's the definition of a customer? What's an invoice, etc.? What does a particular field mean? Maybe what does a department mean across different systems? What does a project mean, etc.? And what you need to make sure is that that data that you're putting into your financial systems is going into established fields versus free text. So rather than it going into comment lines or free text fields, where you're doing some weird and wonderful coding. I've seen all sorts over the years. I've seen people have the description field and they type in manually the INV for invoice number, then put a colon, etc. But all of that leaves you very open to data entry errors and consistency errors. So you want to be working with established fields. So what you're looking to make sure is you're making use of the ability to add custom fields within your different systems, and not just relying on that free text entry. And try to work within the system's intended structure versus fudging it, right? So I've seen a lot of, and it kind of ties into my next point, I've seen a lot of very complex chart of accounts setups, reporting setups, where people have really tried to push the boundaries of the system's data architecture. And that is fine if you're filling a short-term gap. So you're moving systems in the next 12 months or in the next 18 months, right? And you just need to fill the gap to deliver reporting for the business. That is not a future-proofed data strategy. Because you're going to hit challenges later on. So, and this is what this conversation is all about. It's about thinking about how do I make good decisions now so that I don't have to make another decision and go through a world of data migration and pain in 2 years' time. So do not, unless you are all agreed it's a short-term strategy, do not build overly complex structures. So a really classic example of this I've seen is people using their chart of accounts nominal structure, like the departments in it, for projects. And the challenge with that is that projects in most businesses maybe last a year or two max. And so you then end up building out this really big chart of accounts that at some point in the future is going to become unwieldy because you're putting so many projects through, and then it makes it harder to find. You run out of codings, all those kind of maintenance and scalability challenges. So again, it's a short-term gap. You if you're going to do that, you do it in the knowledge that you might have to undo it, and you're going to have more data mapping when you migrate to a new system. So if you can get ahead of that, it's really good to do so. And that's the key thing. You want to think about, if the business grows or changes, is our system in a position to grow with it? If you are hitting the limits of your system now and you're looking to grow, you need to act fast, because you don't want to be in a position where you're behind the curve with finance systems, because it's a lot harder. You need to get ahead of the transition. And when you're thinking about your data architecture, some things you need to think about is, can I get access to dashboards and reports to assess things like completeness and accuracy? Because again, as you're going into this AI era, it's all going to be about data. So that data needs to be clearly defined. It needs to be consistently populated. If you've got loads of gaps where, for instance, maybe people are putting postcode into the address 3 line and things like, small things at this point, but then when you want to use that data for some analysis, it's not there. So really thinking about the quality of your data, as well as the breadth of your data and how well integrated it is so important. And do think about data lifetime and volumes again. So assess each system to say, if we doubled in size and we put double the amounts of data in every month, would this system be able to cope easily? And, after a few years, would it start to hit some slowness issues and things like that? So thinking about those, and don't hard code permissions and validations. And you'll see this a lot. I talk about you don't want to do anything. You don't want to make design decisions around permissions, around workflows, around data architecture that at some point you can't undo. So when you're looking at systems, you're not just looking for like, will it suit my exact requirements right now? What you want to say is, well, if those requirements change, how easy is it for me to change that structure and do things differently? Again, these are all the things, if we want a future-proof system, we need to think about. And a lot of people focus on the here and now and what they want now, and they make decisions based on what they have in front of them. And the reality is that we're living in a world where technology is changing, business is changing, and almost agility is sometimes more important than anything when it comes to choosing technology systems. How well can the system grow, adapt, scale up, scale down to suit my requirements? Okay, so that's a little bit about thinking about data architecture of the systems and the landscape that you're looking at. Now let's move on to APIs. So why are APIs so important? So APIs, again, I'm sorry for those of you that know what an API is, but it's basically, think of it like a translation box that sits outside of your finance system and allows you to pass data through into that system. And it should be upgrade proof. So because it's going through that translation box, when they do new features and functionality, it's using standard objects that the developers have exposed. So it should be strong. So when you're looking at systems, the first question you've got is, does it have an API? If it doesn't have an API, being very transparent and honest, you need to seriously consider whether that's a good investment. So your question around APIs, it should be the first question you ask when it comes to systems, because you never know what you need to integrate, and you might need tools not just to push data in, you might need tools to push data out. So the second question is, how robust are those APIs? And this is a really difficult question to get a good answer to. But some of the ways that you can spot a good API is, can it handle volume? So what's the highest volume of a particular object that customers are pushing through data into? Can the API handle volume? Are there any limits to the volumes that it can handle? There might be a chargeable limit, which is good to know, and you should ask that question. But there might also be a technical limit in that it can only handle up to, 2,000 transactions a month or something like that. So because you need to know that whatever you're looking at can scale, and you need to make sure that the breadth of the API. So what you need to ask them is things like, well, what objects don't exist in the API? So when I put my finance data into system, when I put my fixed assets, I put my customers, are there any objects that I can't get out? How can I see what objects are available to connect to? Objects is like your data. So normally a customer record is an object, an invoice, sales invoices are an object, an AP invoice is an object, for instance, and they'll have lines underneath that. So and you need to get comfortable understanding data architecture in finance. I think, we understand the outputs, we understand the debits and credits, but we need to really understand data architecture and how data connects together. Because, reporting is a key part of our role. So thinking about the robustness, so the volumes it can handle, the objects that are available, obviously security, it's become bigger and bigger over the last few months, actually, with all the things that have been happening, but making sure that you've made sure that they're following good security principles. They've got things like, the standard sort of ISO accreditations from from an API perspective or a software perspective is really important. And really important is good documentation. So if you should be able to go in and see that there's a decent amount of documentation, and not just about the current API, but what happens when there's an upgrade. Is there developer notes or something to show you what's changed when the system's been upgraded and things like that? And another really good sign of a good API is that there's an ecosystem and a marketplace around it. So you do, wherever possible, you need to minimize risk. And part of minimizing that risk is not having a single vendor. And that goes against lots of I would say the sort of the historical thinking, the traditional way of thinking, certainly sort of 10 years ago, was that you wanted an ERP, you wanted one vendor that does everything. The challenge with that is that what that does is that leaves you tied to that vendor, their roadmap and their development, and their technology. And so, you don't have the opportunity to maybe swap different parts of the system in and out. We'll talk about this in a minute. But having an ecosystem of non-vendor apps and integrations is a really good sign that one, that product's well established, but two, it can connect easily to others, right? And so talking to the vendors that you already work with and see, and saying, if you wanted to connect this, how easy would it be? Could you do this? Would you be willing to? Is a really good sign of whether something's well established. And I think, a lot of people say, well, we've got integration. And I think one of the key challenges that you should have for any vendors you're working with is making sure that they have API-based integration. What I've seen recently is a few people try and, I won't say hide, but kind of talk about their integration as being, API-based, when one side of the integration is API. So they're just pulling data out, putting it in like an FTP file and pulling it into another one. So it's part of what we do is we work with multiple partners and vendors, and we have to go and assess how those integrations work as part of the recommendations that we make. And that's one of the things I'm always really cautious on. So making sure you've got an API to API integration and you understand how they integrate, what data objects for all of the systems that you're working with is really important. And that kind of gives you, it's not going to completely de-risk, but it's going to de-risk a lot of your future projects, because maybe there's a great new piece of technology that comes out that you want to take advantage of because it works really well for your industry. If it has an API, and if your current systems have APIs, then you have an ability to connect fairly simply and easily, right? I won't say, it's, sometimes there can be some development costs involved, or there might be a bit of middleware depending on your approach to integration, but fundamentally it's doable. If you don't have APIs, you're very limited in what you can do. And also you're limited, it's high risk to integration if you're going into directly things like databases. Yeah, so APIs kind of de-risk integration because they make sure all of the data that's passed through is complete and follows that software's protocols and validation rules. Yeah, so you want to avoid direct database to database integrations where, at all costs, and you need to be very careful when building and maintaining those. So API integration is a key element and component of a successful finance architecture. Expandability. Now, I kind of dabbled in this a little bit earlier, so I'm kind of going to take it from a different perspective. So what we want in finance is systems that can grow with the business. So as maybe we purchase a new company and those guys have a different kind of business model to us, how well can the systems that we currently use expand to suit different workflows, different business models, etc. So I look at expandability in a couple of different ways. So I'm going to talk you through that now. So expandability, and the kind of the bit that everyone thinks about is, will it cope with volumes and scale? Can I add 100 users and the system will still function? Right? Maybe not 100 users in finance, because I'm hoping we're a little bit more automated than that. But can we add, a significant number of different types of users? And will that impact the speed and or robustness of my system? The second question is modular. So does the systems that I'm using have the ability to turn on, maybe project accounting or inventory, or are there additional reporting capabilities? Can I sort of turn on different elements depending on what the needs of my business are? You do want a base level of capability within your finance system, but especially if you've got a good underlying data architecture, and you've got API integrations, it allows you to make choices about what system to use. So you might go off and use a separate CRM because you need, your B2B versus B2C, and you need a different type of operation model. It might be that you decide to start a subscription, change your business model to subscription, and you need a contracts module. We need, so it's how easy it is to turn on different components. And a lot of people say, well, don't you just want one system that has everything? And that, very often, there's a cost impact to this way of thinking. But my general rule and the way I think about it is I don't want to pay for stuff I'm not using. So if I'm paying for a system to have everything, then the reality is I'm probably paying for things I'm not using. And and then you have to ask the question is, well, what if I need some functionality that isn't in my existing system? Does that mean I have to change out my entire system to meet a particular requirement? So this is where I really focus on non-primary vendor integrations and the marketplace. So for example, when I say primary vendor, so you should, obviously got your core ERP, but can I swap out my AP solution or my credit control capabilities? Can I add that on? I might want to add a layer on of, I'm going to IPO and I want to add in some compliance layers and things like that to really build the robustness of and speed of my reporting. So really thinking about how can my business scale, as in how can my system scale with me? And am I reliant on that primary vendor, my core ERP, doing all of the work and having the same view on what their system does as I have of what they should do? And that's where I think APIs really come into play, because they support you going out and choosing different layers to your architecture, and they allow you to maybe swap out your AP solutions. So maybe you start with something that's quite cheap, just because you don't have a lot of complexity, and then when you hit a certain level of business, or there's a particular solution that has an AI capability that you want to take advantage of, you can just swap that part out. So again, this is where flexibility, agility, and expandability, all the ilities, come into play, and things like tailorability. So what do I mean by that? So I'll talk about this in a little bit, but I don't believe in having a heavy development burden to maintain and manage, right? So what a good core system does is allow you to tweak your workflows and put in various checks and balances, but be able to change them. Yeah. So you should have a system that, if you want a future-proofed system that's going to last for 5 years rather than 12 months, you need to have a system that can be tweaked to suit the changes in your environment, as in your internal environment, but also your external. And I think we're about to go into a period of big change. Both I think in terms of the business landscape and how we operate, but also the technology landscape. So making sure you're geared up to take advantage of that is going to set your business up for success, and could potentially ensure that you have a more robust business moving forwards. And maintenance. Okay, so a lot of people focus on the, how do I get live? They don't think enough about what happens after I go live. So sorts of things you need to think about is, okay, so what's the release cycle for all of the apps that I work with? Is it quarterly? Is it annually? Is it 2 yearly? And a really good way to assess the quality of investment into a product is to look at the last couple of release cycles. What content was in there? What did they release? What did they deliver? And that will give you a good idea of what it is, how invested that part, that developer is to their software. The ease of upgrade process. So is it a systems down to get upgrades? Does it just automatically roll? What does that look like? Is there a sandbox environment? And you need to heavily challenge custom dev, right? So when you're in and again, this is less about, so this is both with existing suppliers and with, potential new solutions that you're looking at. If they say, you give them something to come back and say, yes, we can, but that would be custom. You need to understand if that is fully bespoke codes and screens, or is that a tweak to a setting, or, a little bit of script that goes into an existing screen. Because custom development at different levels adds think of it like a weight, like a challenge for every upgrade, because not only do you may need to maintain that custom dev, but you will need to maintain it for each new upgrade. So if it slows down your ability to upgrade, or it adds more of a challenge, or it means that you can't take advantage of new features, it's going to make you less agile, and it's going to cost you more. So be really careful about what dev that you go for, like things like custom reports, and putting in like a validation. Well, that should be pretty standard. What I'm talking about is like big bits of custom development, fundamentally like new screens that are completely rewritten, or entire I've had some people have decided they come to us and they've got entire programs, and I'm like, the problem with that is you're tied into the developer that's built that for you, as well as that version that they built it on. So thinking through and understanding the upgrade path, if you do those kind of things, is really important. Do they have existing AI capabilities, right? At this stage, they should at least have something that they can show you. They should have some kind of AI capability that is in play, given, if they're not, they're probably behind the curve. So, looking at your existing providers and modules and going, is there just some element of AI? And what are the use cases of AI that you are building to? And asking that question, both of your existing providers and also new ones. Ask, what's the security policies? How easy is it to change permissions? Because as a small business, when you're in the finance team, maybe there's only 2 of you in the finance team at the moment. But if you have a business that's looking to grow, there might be 5 or 6. So, and you might want to give access to data to different individuals. So how easy it is to change what people can see and what they can do within the system. And what are things like backups? What's the protocols around things like that as well? And iClass is under maintenance, but there's 2 things I think are really important, regardless of what platforms you're on, is to build the knowledge of your data architecture and your systems into your team. You should be making sure your team are setting aside time to explore your systems, because because that's how you get value from them. You can obviously have a really great partner. As a Sage partner, we look at what we do and we make sure we try to educate our existing customers, and we make sure we can obviously come back and answer questions. But fundamentally, building the knowledge within your team about your systems, your architecture, your data, allows you to take advantage of the capabilities of that system. You're more likely to be using the systems more fully than if you rely completely on your partner. Yeah. And, there are some instances where if, you've got things like high turnover, I completely understand that in that case, you will have to rely heavily. But obviously, you need to address that underlying issue and then look at how you can build education. And making sure that when you're costing out a system, whether it's an existing system or, you're looking to do some improvements, make sure you put some budget aside for training and development of your staff in that system's capabilities. Have you well-established processes and procedures documented on how it works? When a new release comes out, does your team sit down and review how they can take advantage of that? I've seen that a lot. Is like, they've been, people have been through, they've had a couple of upgrades, and they haven't paid attention to what's coming out in those upgrades and how they can take advantage of it. So making sure you've got an established ongoing system improvement process and team. So people that are responsible for looking at the new releases, embedding the change and building that culture of continuous improvement will help you get more out of your existing systems. But it should be a question that you're asking if you're going in for new systems, right? So all of this should apply to both existing and new systems. So you should be thinking about these things when building out your architecture. And I talk about architecture. So some of the things that I think people tend to think, they just think that an ERP is an ERP, right? I like to think in ERPs and finance systems in layers. So give you some I just thought I'd give you some examples of layers that you might want to consider. So your core is always first, right? I've seen a lot of people jump to stick a really great FP&A and planning tool on top of something small like Xero or Sage 50, and you will go so far, but you will hit problems at some point because of the underlying data architecture. So it doesn't matter how good that layer is. If the base isn't strong, you can't do anything with it. So getting your core right is your first point. Then you can layer on things like FP&A and planning tools, and I put some examples in. We work with some of these, we don't work with all of them, but they give you an example. And if you've got any questions about specific ones, reach out. But you've got your FP&A, your planning tool to do budgeting, forecasting, modeling. Your integration layers. So that might be pulling data out into a data warehouse. It could be doing integration with different systems. I talked about, should all be via API, but you can do it with different layers. And some examples of that. So what you're making sure is that all the data in all of your systems is, robust and being passed in real time. You might have an analytics or BI level. Tableau, Power BI are pretty common ones. There are some others and some of the tools on this do double up, like Profix, for instance. They double up, and some products will do multiple layers. Automation and RPA, again, some of your integration tools can act as that. AI and predictive insight. So this is a new sort of category that's developing. I've put some names in there. At this stage, I think this area is pretty, I would say, is very much bleeding edge, not cutting edge. So be careful in this space. I always suggest that people get, most people don't have the core in place yet, but focusing on, sort of the AI features in your existing tools right now before you put on an AI layer is really important. Making sure that you've got the right ones there. Governance and controls. So very often as companies scale up and they get bigger, they need another layer of month-end, controls and governance and risk management, audit readiness, etc. There's a couple of examples in there. We work with a couple of those. And then workflow collaboration. So all of these things, these layers, some systems will have them, right? So you might have a system that goes across a couple of these layers or does like a part of these layers, or you can pick purpose-built solutions to put on top of your core ERP or finance system. And that is what I mean by agility and adaptability. So having something that can act as a base and give you a basic level of capabilities, but also knowing that there's an integration that you could just tap on to take advantage of some FP&A because you've suddenly got funding from a PE company and they've got an M&A strategy that you need to take advantage of. So think of your system in layers and get your building blocks at the base really strong, get your data secure, make sure you've got good API and integration capabilities, and build from there. So common mistakes, things that I have seen, and this is just based on what I've seen. So, and it sounds obvious, right? Waiting till you need a different system or a different capability before you actually make a decision. You need to start looking ahead. We talk generally about reporting and stop looking back and start looking forward. The same with technology and systems. Technology and systems now are an essential part of finance remit. If you don't have the data and the systems that you need, you cannot perform well as a finance function, and you need to get ahead of it. If you are implementing things at the point where you need them, you are behind the curve in reality, because in most instances, it's going to take you 3 months to implement minimum, right? And that's assuming that you're not massively, under capacity already. So get ahead of what you're going to need, and always be 3 to 6 months ahead in terms of systems as to what you want to be if you want to be a high performing finance team, right? I completely understand that budgets are challenging and putting business cases together and getting the sign off, etc. But when the business comes to you and says, I need this reporting, I need this analysis, we're about, we're going into audit, we're hitting our audit threshold, we need to do this. If you are responding at the point that you have to deliver on those asks and only then looking at systems, you are behind the curve. So a lot of other common things I've seen is when people try to get one system that does everything. We work with systems, we work with Sage, right? And I don't pretend to say that Sage is the right system for every single person, right? But what makes it able to adapt to the majority of organizations is because it's modular. We can turn certain things on. We have a marketplace of partners that we can pull in depending on the size and scale of the business. And that, not relying on a single vendor is really important right now with the way that the technology landscape is changing. So making sure that you have systems that play nicely with others is really important. High custom dev burden. We've actually had customers come to us and said, can you pick up our systems? And we've looked at them and gone, we can't, because you have so much custom dev. Because you've built yourself something that's so bespoke that to upgrade is going to take months, let alone, to edit what, that's just to, replicate what you've already got. So be very careful. And if you have a high custom dev setup, you need to start thinking about how you work your way out of that and changing pieces at a time. Complex data architectures, we talked about that at the beginning. Make sure you are not trying to fudge your data architecture. You're not trying to do weird and wonderful things as a long-term solution with free text fields, etc., because you will end up at some point coming unstuck. You might need to edit something and it's not editable, or somebody, there's a data keying error, and that could mean the difference between you making a profit in your P&L and not. So being very careful about your data architecture, making sure you've got robust field level validations around what goes into fields and how it's formatted, etc., so that when you want to take advantage of good reporting tools, you want to use AI, that your data structure is robust enough to support it. Dead-end design path. So making choices around how you configure your systems in a way that if you want to change things or take advantage of new features and capabilities later on, you can't. So I call them dead-end design paths. So making processes that you have no option but to work that way and you can't change it. And again, that normally ties into some custom dev. People ignore data quality, right? So they have these systems, but they don't even think about, well, how well populated is our data? How well have we put data in the right fields when we're migrating systems and rushing data migration? So yeah, think about data quality. Not digging deep enough on integration dependencies. So really making sure that your vendors that you're working with tell you how things integrate, what objects, what method, are using API, if they've got pre-built connectors, etc. Getting into that is really important. And underestimating change management and training needs for both new implementations and existing, right? You should have regular contact with your current vendors. You should be speaking to them. I would think on at least a 6-month basis and talking about new features and capabilities in your plans. If your team aren't doing that, or if they haven't had training on your system for a few years, you need to make sure that you've got budget for that. And you're investing in, do they know what features and capabilities this system has? Because you might end up paying for a new system when actually your existing system could deliver what you need, but you just didn't know it could because you've not stayed on top of its capabilities, right? We can get into an argument about whose responsibility that is, right? And for me, it's a partnership between you and your software partners to make sure that you are being proactive and they are being proactive to support you. So making sure that you've got that, you've given your team the best chance of success is really important. Okay. So I hope that's been useful, guys. A bit of a download based on some conversations I've had recently. And I've had some interesting asks for the podcast. So we're going to try something different on the next FTL session. We're going to do an Ask Me Anything. Think of it like agony aunt for financial transformation, right? So give me a challenge. You can make it as broad or as specific as you like. Send it to me, podcast at itassolutions.co.uk, or send me a message on LinkedIn with your ask. Ask me anything. So what I'm going to do is pull out, the questions and queries I get asked, and I'm going to walk it through. Potentially going to try and grab one of my transformation guys in, and we're gonna talk this through together and give you answers to those queries. So I don't mind if it's a people challenge, a process challenge, a technology challenge. It could be up the chain. It could be a challenge you're trying to get your CFO on board. It could be the wider business, whatever it is. Send me your questions and your transformation challenges, and we're going to have a kind of a Q&A / agony aunt style FTL next time. So I hope you've enjoyed this session and you've got some value from it. As always, I like to give you guys some resources. So we've got building out your finance data strategy. So I've talked a lot about data, but there's way more in depth on that on our previous FTL. Have a look at that. Sage database guide. I have one for Sage 200, and I've got one developing for some of the other Sage products. So if you're interested in that, send me a quick message. And for those that are using Sage itself, so Sage Intact, and you're thinking, how do I get more out of that? We've got a session on reporting tools in Sage Intact. So you can take advantage of that as well. Awesome. Okay, well, thank you so much. My email is there. So whether that's podcast or whether you send me an email directly with your questions for that next FTL, would love to hear from you. I hope you've enjoyed this session. If you have, please do leave me a review. It helps me know that the content that we're producing is valuable. If you have any suggestions for improvements, perhaps this session wasn't as valuable as some other ones, tell me why. I'm very much in a review and design of my next 6 months of content at the moment. So I'd love to hear from you, our listeners, and get some feedback. So there we go. So that's the ask for this week. So either leave us a review or give me some feedback. I'd love to get some thoughts from you. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time on Financial Transformation Live.